Hi class, welcome to this presentation on the composition and principles of design. So what is composition? It's really how the elements, and by elements it can be any objects or figures or things in the background like trees or text, are arranged. So how you're moving things around and arranging them. It's the layout, how you decide to lay things out. Here's a quote from an art history textbook. It says, "The organization of lines, shapes, colors, and other elements in a work of art." So the artist or designer chooses what to emphasize in their composition, and we call this hierarchy. So the focal point is something that has the most emphasis in the composition, and that makes it at the top of the hierarchy. So as the artist slash designer, you can tell your viewers where to look by the size of something, where you place it, the color you give it, the value, the light or dark that you give it. You can tell people how to look at your work, where to look first, and how you want their eye to move through it. That happens with the hierarchy. So we're going to go through these principles of design, and you use the principles of design to create strong compositions. So what are the principles of design? They're basic guidelines for creating great compositions, engaging, well-designed artwork. They also give us a common vocabulary for discussions, so terms we can all understand and talk about. It gives us a way to talk about art, a way to talk about your own art and then other people's. There are a lot of principles of design, different lists and examples out there for you to look at. And I just want you to experiment and find what's right for you, for your compositions. And it can change, obviously, over time. A composition can have more than one principle of design in it. In fact, there's often more than one principle of design that you can find in a composition. And these are really not strict rules. They're just like guides to help you create compositions and to create strong compositions and give us all this foundation, right, that we're working on. So I think in art especially, rules can and should be broken. But before you break a rule, you have to understand it, right? So that's what we're going to do this week. This is a one-page like PDF from Getty Education, from the Getty Museum's Education Department, that I think is really helpful. So anytime there's something underlined in these presentation slides, you can get a link. So that'll be there in your online class to download or to go to the link if you want to from the slides. So this is just an overview of some of the typical principles of design. So balance. Balance is how different elements are distributed in a composition. So, the elements like we talked about, colors, textures, text, anything, objects. So it's really how you're distributing them throughout, either if it's symmetrical balance or asymmetrical. Here's an artist from Argentina who's still living, giving us really great asymmetrical balance. So there's some pretty symmetrical balance in this figure's shirt with the black and the blue. And then there's asymmetrical balance in the way the leg is up on the left and down on the right, but we have balance in these background shapes and how the hand moves out of this rectangle shape, and then there's a little bit of a shadow on the bottom right. That's all balancing out this very nice, clean composition. Here's a really different example, but also an example of balance from Picasso. So the blue is really the only color, the blue and the gray is the only color we have here. And that bright color is balanced out by all the brown and neutral colors around it. There's also a balance of shapes here. There's a lot of different shapes happening, but there's a balance of, the circular round shapes and the more triangular and rectangular shapes. So emphasis. So something that really stands out or draws your attention in a composition, it's often used creating contrast with color or line or texture. So this is the famous I Love New York design, and I think we see this everywhere, but we don't realize that a designer, an artist created this. This is Milton Glaser. I had done this presentation and found images of some of the artists. So it's from an older presentation. So I'm including the pictures because I think they're fun. And I was excited when I found some of these old photos. So sometimes I have pictures of the artist. So there's a really strong emphasis created with the contrast here between the black and the red. And we usually see this on a white background. And the drawing on the top is what Milton Glaser drew to create this design. And I believe the legend is that he drew it in a taxi cab, in one of the yellow taxi cabs in the 1970s, on a piece of envelope. So I think that's such a great way, like we talk about making sketches or just playing around, something as iconic as this design that's now printed on bags and hats and shirts was just, doodled in the back of a taxi cab. So proportion and scale. So proportion is about the whole. So the size relationship between parts of a whole. So let's say there's a lot of proportions in the human figure, in the human body, especially in art. We learn a lot about this when you're studying the human body. So the whole is the human body, and the proportions are how big is the hand compared to the face, or you might have done this like your foot reaches from your elbow to your wrist. Those are proportions within the human body. Then the scale is the size in relation to other things around it. So something can look a lot larger compared to something else next to it. So this is an example of Lisa Hanawalt, who is still living, from the Tuca and Birdie cartoon. That's on Netflix, I think. So cartoons use a lot of scale and proportion for humor and dramatic effect. And this is anthropomorphism, where these animals are put on human bodies. So the scale here is really off. These birds and cats are all the same size, and they're walking around on two legs, and it's hilarious and it makes it funny. So scale can really create a lot. If you play with scale, it can really create a lot of interesting effects. This artist, Lisa Hanawalt, also created the characters and drawings for BoJack Horseman. So you might recognize the style, another cartoon. And she does a lot of watercolor painting and a lot of drawing. She has a pretty active Instagram last time I checked. Okay, pattern and repetition. Pattern is repeated objects or symbols or any kind of elements like we've been talking about throughout the entire composition. And then repetition is used in pattern, or it can be used outside of a pattern. So any kind of repeated elements in a composition can create unity. So this is wallpaper created by this woman. I have a picture of Katie Dede. She's a Brooklyn-based, part of a Brooklyn-based wallpaper company called Grow House Grow. And wallpaper uses patterns which have repetition in them, right, to create these what we call seamless designs. Adds a lot of interest to interiors, and wallpaper design has come back in recent years because there's a new adhesive where you can remove it so people who rent can use it. And I just think these designs are really interesting and cool. Okay, rhythm and movement is repeated elements can work together to create kind of a sense of rhythm or make something look like it's moving, even if it's not in a video, right? And the artist or designer can guide the viewer's eye through the work, like we were talking about with the hierarchy. So you're using these elements to create a path that moves the viewer through the composition. This is Aaron Douglas. He was a leader in the Harlem Renaissance movement, and this was created in 1934. If you don't know about the Harlem Renaissance, I encourage you to look it up. I included some sources on the bottom, some links, so you could learn more about this artist. This is a large painting on oil and canvas called Aspects of Negro Life from Slavery to Reconstruction. So in the Harlem Renaissance, it was musicians, visual artists, poets, writers all coming together to create this amazing, vibrant culture for Black people in New York City. And Aaron Douglas was a big leader in this, and this is one of his most famous paintings, and it has so much energy and movement, and part of that is created through this repetition. There's like the circles in the background that we can see that are almost like, I think that creates movement. Also, there's almost a wave happening with the way the figures and the background elements are placed. So we can see a lot of rhythm and movement, which of course in the Harlem Renaissance, there was a lot of jazz music happening. It was this bright, exciting culture where there was music, and we can see how this artist, Aaron Douglas, was influenced by the music of that time. Here's another example of movement and repetition, but really different, right? So I'm trying to show you a lot of different things. This is also more similar to what we'll be doing in our project with this gouache painted on paper and then cut and pasted. So we're going to make some cut paper compositions, and then you're going to do paintings of them in gouache. So not exactly the same, but a similar process. This is called The Snail by Henri Matisse. And we can see movement in that it's sort of creating a spiral or a circle, the way that these shapes are cut out. And it's also using repetition, using the same type of shapes over and over. Okay, unity and variety. So unity is cohesiveness. It creates harmony. It's a united whole. And then variety is difference, which adds interest. And I put these together because they really work well together. A balance of both unity and variety makes for really strong compositions. And they can, of course, exist within the same work of art. This is a Mexican artist still living, Ana Ramirez Gonzalez, and there's a lot of variety in the work. So there's a lot going on, a lot of detail in these illustrations, but then the unity of the color scheme or the line work and the shape brings it together and makes it a cohesive whole. So if you have something with a lot of variety, a lot of different shapes, a lot of different stuff going on, think of how you can unify those things the way that this artist does so well. She also works at Pixar and worked on the animation Coco, if you might recognize sort of this style from Coco. So she is really interesting and has a pretty exciting career. She also illustrates children's books. Okay, negative space. So the negative space is the space around the objects or figures. You can call it the background or the ground. Negative space is just as important as the positive space. Now, the positive space would be those objects or figures. It's a place for your eye to rest. It also creates its own shapes, its own compositional shapes, and it's part of the compositional structure. So in this project, I don't want you to forget to pay attention to that negative space. In this one by Elizabeth Murray, another American artist who's still alive, notice the negative space in between these two kind of half heart-shaped red and green objects. There's this negative space that creates its own new shape. And then we see kind of a reference to that shape in the purplish blue color up top. So there's this like windy, wiggly line that goes through the center, and the negative space is creating something really interesting. There's also the triangle shapes on the edges that are created in negative space. That's really helping this composition too. here's a really different piece of art, but also making great use of negative space. We see that big triangle created in the middle, and then other shapes and triangles created outside of these three rectangles. And then there's unity created by this oval that's drawn, and unity created that all the shapes are the same. And then there's variety in the texture and in the color. So this is Robert Mangold, another living American artist. Okay, so for your warm-up, all you're doing is cutting out at least 10 closed shapes from your shape library that you made last week. You're just taking a photo or scan, that's it. I'll show you at the end of this how to do it really quickly. Then for your project, which your warm-up is pretty simple because I want you to spend a lot of time on this, you're going to create 3 different compositions. Each one should represent a different principle of design. So you can pick 3 principles of design and make 3 compositions, or you can start with the compositions and attach a principle of design to it. It's okay, and I expect that your compositions can have more than one principle of design, but just be sure to focus on one main one that you're going to name it. I really want you to take time arranging these shapes. I'll show you how to do it in another video. You're using the shapes from your shape library, and I want you to make a lot of different compositions. So we're using these cutout shapes so you can really play around and have fun with it, and you can make your compositions really strong. You're going to be using these compositions in some future projects to create paintings. So they're going to be like your reference that you will make a painting of. You're not painting on top of it, you're making a separate painting, but looking at these compositions as a starting point. So you're building abstract compositions with intention. We're not just creating something out of nothing, we're really thinking about the structure, the building blocks of your composition. Remember to think about both positive and negative space in your compositions. That's really important. And then when you're happy with your 3 compositions, you can glue or tape them onto paper. And then I want you to take out some pen, and I'll show you how to do all this. And we're going to use different line widths. So some really thick lines, some thin lines, everything in between. And you can trace these closed shapes to help define that negative and positive space and other elements of your composition. And then you're going to add some open shapes with pen. You're just going to draw it on top of your little collage of shapes that you've made to further help get those design principles in there. You will be labeling each composition with its principle of design for the discussions to make it easier to talk about. All right, I'm going to quickly show you how I'm cutting up these shapes, and then there'll be another video for the project demo. All right, so I have my shape library, and all I'm doing is cutting out the closed shapes. So, this is an open shape, but this one would be closed. And what I usually do to help with cutting is just get a piece like that, and you can, just with regular scissors, it doesn't have to be perfect. Get it as good as you can. And you're going to do at least 10 of these to help create your compositions. So this is really just getting you set up for your project so you can make your compositions with these. And if you have, some tricky areas, just take your time, and because having some of these details might be nice, but again, it's not going to be obviously perfect. You're just getting the basic shapes down, and having 10 to work with is great. If you have more, that could help too. So put on some music or a podcast or TV and get into cutting your shapes. You could also use a X-Acto knife if you wanted to, and a cutting board if that's something that you have. Feel free to go ahead and use that. And I'm assuming if it's something that you have, you know how to use it, but regular old scissors will work just fine. And then you should have 10 of these shapes.